Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 15th of July, and today we're going to be doing a full front update, mainly focusing on the situations around Zaporizhia, Berkhivka, and Novoselivske, where I have an update. We're going to begin by talking about what happened around Robotyne. And so I have changed the map a little bit, and I've given Ukraine some more land, which I think more accurately reflects the situation on the ground. Now, of course, there's a gray zone in this area, and I really am thinking of making certain parts of the map blank, neither red nor blue, because I do think it's a bit inaccurate to say that each square meter of land is firmly under one side's control. But generally, this is what I would say the front line looks like, because the Ukrainians are conducting attacks from the northeast towards Robotyne, and they have certainly expanded their zone of control in this area. First, they took over the nature reserve. We've been talking about that for a while. Then they launched this very deep assault towards this Russian trench line directly to the south of the nature reserve. Now, that's still contested. Some of the trenches under Russian control, some of the trenches under Ukrainian control. But then a bit further to the west, the Ukrainians also did take over some parts of the open fields. They did also take some bush lines associated with these fields. And each square meter counts in this regard, because Ukraine is trying to clear up all the positions to the northeast of Robotyne in order to actually reach the outskirts of the town itself. And so now I would say that in terms of the distances from the town itself, perhaps it's like 0.7 miles away. Ukraine needs to advance another 0.7 miles in order to reach the town itself, to reach the cemetery in the northern part of the town. And the town of Robotyne itself is being defended by the 71st Guards Motor Regiment and also by the 45th Special Purpose Brigade, its Spetsnaz unit, and also by the 291st. Let's open it up actually. The 291st Guards Motor Rifle Regiment. Those three units are involved in the defense, and they're being aided by the UAVs provided by the BOBR UAV unit. And so, what's going on around here as of recently is that this 47th and 65th Brigades, they are moving in more armored columns. And in terms of the sort of equipment they're using, just looking at publicly available videos, they do post a lot on their Facebook accounts, both of these units. The Ukrainians from these 47th and 65th Brigades, they have at their disposal at least, but probably more than 10 M2 Bradleys and more than five. I'm just saying more than because it's probably not five, it's probably more based on what we're seeing, but more than five BMP 1s and more than five Panthera T6 light armored vehicles. And those can carry about 9 men on them in total. And so you're seeing how these lighter, more mobile vehicles that are suitable for this sort of terrain are being utilized by the Ukrainians. And of course, these are more so Western sort of equipment that's been moved in recently and sent to the new units that are being sent to the front line associated with the 10th Army Corps, which is a new Army Corps that was created in 2023 by the Ukrainians. Also, you have more than 10 YPR 765 infantry fighting vehicles that are associated with the 65th Brigade. And so those are also being used by the Ukrainians in these armored columns. And then again, they are being sent to the front line. There's also Ukrainian tanks like the T-64, so, this old Soviet weaponry. But they are equipped with mine trawls, and their goal is to clear the mines that the Russians have placed in this certain area of the front line in many of these fields. So generally, this area of the front line doesn't actually have that many mines. A lot of them have either not been cleared or the Russians have just not placed them in this area, which is why the Ukrainians are trying to attack from the northeast into Robotyne. But there are still obviously some mines that have been placed throughout the course of the war, and so there's just footage here showing the Ukrainians clearing that. We also have some footage of Russian ATGMs hitting what they allege to be a Bradley, and this also shows that the Ukrainians may be closer to Robotyne than we think. I'm just not indicating that the front line is at that area, because having one vehicle in one certain field isn't enough to say that an entire Ukrainian unit is stationed there. That could just be a forward vehicle that got very close to the town and was pushed back by Russian fire. But again, that geolocation is 0.7 miles away from Robotyne, so it is still pretty close. You can see how the Ukrainians have generally inched closer over the past few days, albeit with pretty heavy casualties. Just not even just for their vehicles. There's been at least one Bradley that I've seen that's been captured by the Russians. That video has been released recently. but also for the troops that are being dropped off. They're dismounting from the vehicles to try to go through these bush fields, these bush lines you could see over here. I'm just drawing lines from certain areas where they could advance through to reach Robotyne. And I'm sure there was fighting going on for every single one of these bush lines every day, especially at night. What I'm hearing from Russian sources that the most heavy fighting is occurring at night in this area. And it is important for Ukraine to secure these bush lines, and it gives them a passageway to reach the town themselves. And the thing is, this is basically a thing that we're seeing across the entire front line, not just in Robotyne, but in every single town where there's fighting. The Ukrainians are utilizing bushlands, and that's just part of the course. It's part of the local geography. Obviously, people are going to take advantage of the trees that give them concealment and allow them to advance under, not cover obviously, but under some sort of concealment. And so the Ukrainian assaults in this area, they are being covered by artillery, specifically by M109 self-propelled howitzers. Those have been supplied, a lot of them, to these new units from the 10th Army Corps. And then, of course, from Ukrainian Soviet-era tanks and some of the new Western tanks as well. Some of those tanks are coming in from Poland, actually. And then also mortar crews that are assisting. And then the Russians obviously have artillery of their own, and so there's artillery duels going on in this area. And as I said before, most of the fighting occurring during the nighttime. Now, if we zoom out, you'll notice that one of the main units that is involved in defending the Russian front line in Zaporizhia is the 58th Army. And so the guy who was commanding this army was Major General Ivan Popov. And this is old news, I believe it's from July 11th, but I just never got around to mentioning it, but it is pretty important. Major General Ivan Popov, who was the commander of the 58th Army, he actually resigned from his position. And he gave some concrete reasons and concrete concerns as to why he resigned and why he's disappointed in the current state of the Russian military in this area. So he said that Russia, for instance, lacked counter battery fire. They were not able to effectively respond to Ukraine's artillery strikes by pinpointing the origins of those strikes and effectively firing back. That was one concern. Also, he talked about the reconnaissance associated with finding suitable places to hit with artillery. So usually with each one of these artillery batteries that the Russians have, there's usually an Orlan 10, which is one of these reconnaissance UAVs that's supposed to be attached to it and supposed to be going out towards the Ukrainian lines and looking for suitable targets and then sending that back to the headquarters. And then from there, they pinpoint the area that should be struck, and then, that's when the artillery strikes occur. And so he was just saying that there were issues with this and that they were not able to effectively provide reconnaissance and information. So that was another criticism. He also talked about issues with logistics and supplies towards the front line. So all in all, he said that these issues were causing unnecessary deaths within the Russian ranks, and he blamed the higher ups, and this is of course now a common theme after we saw Prigozhin do it, and now more subordinates within the Russian military are starting to blame them. He's been blaming Shoigu and Gerasimov. And Gerasimov specifically, we hadn't heard from him in a while, ever since the Wagner mutiny. And in recent days, he actually made his first public appearance. So there was originally rumors that Gerasimov would be removed from his position as chief of staff, but that never ended up happening. And now he's making public appearances under the context of his role in that position. So it looks like he's here to stay for now. And so Popov at least was blaming them for the failures of the Russian forces. But Popov, I will just mention, he helped build a lot of the defenses that I have mapped over here. A lot of these black lines that show fortifications. Popov was responsible for setting those up. Of course, Surovikin also played a role in that, and a lot of other local generals. And also, Popov was one of the guys who helped defend the Russian line, the first line of contact, when the counteroffensive initially began a month ago. And so he certainly does have some sort of acumen in order to be doing that, even with the circumstances that he laid out in terms of Russia's issues with their military. But anyway, let's move on to the situation around Bakhmut, where we do have some updates. But first, I'm actually going to go to Velyka Novosilka. I think this is the second time I've done that. I also did that in the last video. But anyway, let's go into what's happening in this sector. So, the Ukrainians are continuing their attacks in the direction of Prutne, specifically, as we said before, 36th Brigade, 35th Brigade, 31st Brigade. Those are the main units that are assaulting in the direction of Putnia. So not much change in that direction. This is just generally how they're attacking it from the north, from that nature reserve, which you took control over. They're also attacking the town of Stepove from Levadne. And so that's another new axis of attack that just opened up. The main assaults that we've seen occur over the past few days from the Ukrainian side have been in the direction of Stormayorske and Ruzhnia. So recently the Ukrainians, they launched this massive artillery barrage in the direction of Ruzhnia, and then that was followed up by an infantry assault. And the Ukrainians already do have positions that are very close to Ruzhnia. The northern part of it is actually contested. But nevertheless, the Russians have been able to repulse all attacks from, Blaodatne, Makarivka, Storozheve, Noskutne, all these towns. And so far, the Russians are holding the line at Oruzhne. Because the thing is, once Oruzhne falls, the Ukrainians will have access to this road that directly leads to Staromlynivka. And I've talked about multiple times now, that Staromlynivka is the main Russian hub of coordination in the entire Vermivka salient. And it is also this town where all these other local roads branch out of. And so it's important that the Russians hold on to it if they want to have a local domination over the entire sector. And so the Ukrainians would be given a free passage all the way into Staromlynivka if they were able to take Eruzhnia. So that's why the Russians are defending it. Then in terms of Novoselivske, there were also assaults by the Ukrainians in that direction. All of them have been repelled. And so that's really the situation in that direction. No meaningful changes just yet. Let's go on to Bakhmut, where we do actually have frontline changes. So around Klishchiivka, or more generally the southern flank of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have been unable to, in the past few days, to break through into the town of Klishchiivka itself. And so what we're seeing now is that they're trying to expand their horizons and they're looking further south. Now the Ukrainians have crossed the canal at a new spot that's further to the south, and I'm marking it with these blue lines. And they've taken over generally the positions within this square. And let's look at the distances in which they advance just to get an idea. So at most they advance 0.9 miles. And the area towards which they're advancing is adjacent to the canal. It's also approaching the key town of Kordyumivka. We already know that the Ukrainians are very close to Kordyumivka due to the fact that Kordyumivka is close to the canal, and so the Ukrainians do have positions that are adjacent to the canal and by extension to Kordyumivka, but they have not tried crossing the canal directly into Kordyumivka, which does make sense because you have all of these Russian military forces within the town itself, so you don't want to launch a head-on assault. But what Ukraine is doing is crossing it a bit to the north, clearing out some of the bush lines that are adjacent to the canal. And then from there, they have a very solid position on the northern flank of Kordyumivka, which will allow them to launch concurrent assaults, not only from the north, but then also probably crossing it through this land bridge. And then you have a two-pronged attack. And Kordyumivka, it's a local stronghold for the Russians. They did have some of their forward headquarters over here and heavy equipment, but I don't know how much they have left now because of how close it is to the front line. So we're going to have to see if Ukraine continues to tap into their gains in this area, which they've made over the past 24 hours, and continue this advance south instead of attacking Klishchiivka. Or who knows, maybe they're going to try to now go to the north now and attack Klishchiivka from the south. That's another possibility, but we do know that they are advancing in that direction. In terms of Klishchiivka, the Russians are holding the line over there. There's very heavy fights for the heights that are overlooking Klishchiivka. Right now, it's sort of split 50-50 between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians do have control over these heights over here, which are important in order to give them equal footing. And then the Ukrainians also have control over some of the heights in that direction. So we're going to have to see how that's unfolding, especially as both sides continue to move in reinforcements. And for the first time, we're now actually seeing the Russians take over Ukrainian POWs. They're actually taking some of them prisoner. And that's something that we haven't seen in a while in this area. There was a recent video of 7 Ukrainian troops being taken POW. I'm sure there's also some in the other way around where Ukrainians are taking Russians POW. I actually have videos of that from the 3rd Assault Brigade taking over individual Russians as POWs, but they weren't in a group of 7 like in that video. But anyway, situation in Klishchiivka is basically the same as it was before. In terms of Berkhivka, the Russian 98th Guards Airborne Division went on the counterattack, and they retook, let's look at the distances actually, about 0.6 miles of land. That's generally how much they advanced in this direction. Maybe a bit more depending on where you're measuring it from. But generally, they advanced, a little less than a mile in this direction. And this is pretty significant because Ukrainians were the ones that were attempting to make gains in this direction. They tried fortifying themselves in the southwestern corner of this town over here. They were pushed out by the 98th Division. And now we're seeing the 98th Division going on the counterattack, taking over the fields that are in between Berkhivka and the main Ukrainian position in this region, which is in the dam area to the south of the Berkhivka reservoir. And so now the Russians have been able to take over parts of this dam area where you do have Ukrainian forward elements. And this is making it much more difficult for Ukraine in the future to go on the offensive towards Berkhivka. They can still attack, Yahidny. That's still pretty realistic when you think about it in terms of distances. But Berkhivka is going to be more difficult if the Russians continue to apply the pressure that they are right now. And the Ukrainians did attempt to counterattack to reverse the Russian gains in this area, which, if you want to just get a visualization of that, look a bit like this. This is generally the area, the fields where the Russians were able to advance in that red square. The Ukrainians did try counterattacking, but they were repulsed by the Russian forces. So now let's go on to the situation in Novoselivske, where I do have a bit of a clarification on what's going on. So within the town itself, the Ukrainians have withdrawn, and Russians are taking a position within the town itself. But the main Russian concentration is in the rail line and in the depot associated with it. So you don't have that many Russian forces within the western part of Novoselivske itself. Most of them are a bit to the east. But there's no Ukrainian forces really fighting anymore for the town of Novoselivske itself. It has turned into more sort of a gray zone. And the reason why the Russians are not occupying it now is because most of the town, if you look at the drone footage, is totally decimated. And so once you're stepping in there, it's like there's not that much cover. Obviously, you could hide in the debris of the houses, but it's very hard to move a large contingent of forces through that without being spotted by the Ukrainian UAVs. And so the Russians are sort of on the side of caution in that regard by not entering it yet. And so for now, most of the fighting is still going on the southern flank of Novoselivske, because now what we're seeing is the Russians are trying to seriously push in the direction of Berkhivka, which is a local Ukrainian stronghold. They do have a lot of forces there, especially from the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, which is the main Ukrainian force in this area defending against the Russian attacks. So we're going to have to see how that unfolds, because if the Russians are able to secure all of the heights in this area, and I'd say the heights sort of are within this red rectangle, give or take, if they're able to get full control over that, then Berkhivka, that's in a valley. And so the Russians are going to be overlooking all of the Ukrainian positions within Berkhivka. It's going to make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to defend in that area. And so that opens up new possibilities for Russian attacks. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.